Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Synergy, Closing the 90-Day Window. My name is Virginia Mundos. I'm a Senior Program Manager with our Professional Services team here at Citrix. I'm joined today by Nicholas Rentalen, a Citrix Consulting Principal Architect, and George Karuvila, a Citrix Sales Engineering Distinguished Engineer. Before we get into the presentation, let me review quickly a few housekeeping details. We'll have a live Q&A session towards the end of today's event, and you're welcome to submit your questions during the presentation. Simply type your question into the Ask a Question window and click Submit. Also, we are recording the event, and the on-demand version will be available from the same link that you used to join today. So feel free to come back, watch the archive, or share it with your colleagues. And finally, the slides are available for download from the top of the Event Resources tab located along the top of the interface. Okay, let me go ahead and pass it over to George to kick things off for us. George?
Thanks, Virginia. As Virginia mentioned, my name is George Karuvila. I'm part of the Enterprise Sales Engineering Group. I've been with Citrix nearly 6 years, and I'm really glad to be part of this webinar, tag teaming with Nick and going over some of the key announcements from Synergy and digging a little deeper, and also talking about revisiting some of the commitments we made at Synergy and where we stand today. Let's take a quick look at the agenda. So we will kick things off by going over some of the highlights from Synergy, and from there we will look in depth at some of the key announcements, including Workspace app, analytics, app access control, and such. Then we'll look at some of the big ticket items that did not make the keynote but are very relevant to some of our on-premises customers. So looking into XenApp and XenDesktop features and such, including Outlook search indexing, UPM, and others. And lastly, we'll provide you some resources to dig deeper into some of the content that we are covering, and also look at some training resources that are available through us. So let's dig right in. Taking a look at the keynote highlights, Dave Henshall, our CEO, talked about our three key priorities. The first being unification of our product portfolio, which allows our users to consume our services in a more simplistic manner, and it also simplifies IT organizations' abilities to actually deliver these services to the end users. Secondly, we want to help customers accelerate to the cloud by providing a very rich set of cloud services that the customers can consume, and thereby helping them in their cloud journey and embracing the hybrid cloud. And lastly, expanding to new areas such as the secure digital perimeter with services like analytics and app access control that are now being made available. So the announcement that probably gathered the most interest from our customers and attendees at Synergy was the Citrix Workspace app. And Citrix Workspace app, in essence, allows IT organizations to deliver their end users, basically giving their end users access to any app, whether that's a SaaS-based application, Windows, web, mobile application, and also all of the content, whether that's on-premises, in the cloud, and from various data sources such as network share, SharePoint, public cloud providers like Box, OneDrive, etc. All in a unified, all in a single pane of glass with contextual access and performance, thereby ensuring the users the most productive environment no matter where they connect in from and on any network. From an IT organization perspective, we also provide complete visibility and also understand typical user behavior and deviations from user behavior, thereby allowing organizations to identify security risks and then providing automated actions that they can act upon. Now, one of the elements of the Workspace app is the ability to provide access to SaaS and web applications. And this is made possible with Citrix Access Control, which allows end users to not only access their SaaS applications from within the Workspace app, but provide single sign-on and securely deliver these apps, thereby protecting intellectual property and also protecting against ransomware, malware, and such. Now, we touched on visibility a little earlier, and this is made possible with Citrix Analytics, which is a closed-loop autonomous system that looks at all of the services that the user is consuming through Workspace, and then collects various data points in terms of what the user is actually doing, and then identifies the user's security risks and provides risk indicators and then allows IT organizations to act upon these risk indicators. Google was front and center at Citrix Synergy this year, and our partnership with Google goes back almost 7 years now. But what we announced at Synergy was our ability to leverage Google Cloud as one of the resource locations and then tie it to Citrix Cloud Services, thereby allowing us to deliver virtual apps and desktops directly from within Google Cloud in an automated fashion. Now, this bodes well with our any story, and for customers that are looking at leveraging public clouds for deploying their workloads, this is Google Cloud's a great option to add to the portfolio. We also announced that we will have general availability of Citrix Cloud within Azure Gov, and this is of particular interest to our public sector customers, allowing them to consume Citrix Cloud services leveraged directly from Citrix Cloud Control Plane running in Azure Gov. And initially, the release will support XenApp and XenDesktop service, but we plan to build on that portfolio. As far as Microsoft goes, we announced day one support for Server 2019 and RDSH workloads. We will also be able to deliver RDMI-based resources directly from within Workspace. We announced general availability of Workspace Hub, and for those of you who are not familiar with Workspace Hub, it's a low-cost thin client, sub $100. That is fully supported by Citrix and available through two of our partners, ViewSonic and N Computing. And what's nice about this offering is that while it's a low-cost option, it has various features such as dual monitor support, Skype optimization, multimedia offload, and such. And we also announced the ability to cast sessions directly from cast an existing ICA-based session directly from your endpoint to any monitor that's tied to a Workspace Hub. So in other words, if you're walking into a meeting room and you want to cast your existing session, you can do that. Or if you wanted to go into an office and they've got hoteling, you can essentially transfer your session from your mobile phone or iPad or laptop directly to that device. Now, what about endpoint management? So there was a lot of announcements around unified endpoint management. So traditionally, we've talked about our capabilities to manage mobile devices, but we've solidified that solution, extended our capabilities to physical endpoints, whether that's Windows, Mac, even Chromebooks, and also other devices like Apple TV, Alexa for business and such. Of specific interest is our capabilities around Windows endpoints, where we can now coexist with SCCM, and we provide a rich set of capabilities as far as managing those endpoints go, whether that's a corporate-owned asset or a BYO asset. And lastly, with regards to automation and orchestration, we announced our partnership with ServiceNow, whereby IT can essentially offer a set of services directly within their ServiceNow catalog, Citrix-based services, and an end user can go into that ServiceNow catalog and request a service. So for instance, they could go in there and request a VDI instance with a specific CPU and memory requirement. And this would then trigger a workflow, and a manager can essentially approve that workflow. And once it's approved, we can, our ITSM connector can then automate the provisioning of those resources for that end user and also log those changes within the change management database. This also facilitates things like chargeback. So by the user just selecting a resource within ServiceNow catalog and the automation and orchestration, the resource will then be made available directly within Workspace. So that's of particular interest to a lot of our customers, since 60 to 70% of all customers leverage ServiceNow today. So moving on, let's dig a little deeper into our access control capabilities within Workspace app. And as I mentioned earlier, Workspace app allows you to front-end essentially any type of application, including SaaS and web applications. With regards to SaaS and web applications, we will be providing a catalog of nearly 40 SaaS applications that the customers can deliver to their end users. And we can integrate with those vendors and provide single sign-on using SAML and such. In addition, Workspace app will have an embedded web browser available as part of it that allows you to deliver these SaaS applications in the most secure fashion, allowing you to set security policies like denying clipboarding, printing, watermarking the session, and such. And in addition to that, we have our secure web gateway service integrated with Workspace app, thereby allowing URL filtering, blacklist, whitelist, and such. We talked a little bit about Azure Gov support with our control plane being made available within Azure Gov. This allows our public sector customers who have stringent security requirements to take advantage of this service for delivering XenApp and XenDesktop based workloads initially, and we'll be extending this to XenMobile and ShareFile in the future. And lastly, from a Google Cloud perspective, as I mentioned earlier, we now can deliver virtual apps and desktops within Google Cloud leveraging Citrix Cloud Services. And we have, I believe we've already GA'd the auto-scale functionality, which allows you to dynamically power manage workloads within Google Cloud. And image management with MCS is expected to release sometime in the second half of this year. So let's talk a little bit more about Workspace app. So what makes up the Workspace app? The first piece of that would be the HTX engine. This is no different from Receiver, and this is what allows you to deliver your virtual apps and desktops. In addition to that, we've added the browser engine, which allows you to essentially let users access SaaS applications while taking advantage of our secure browser service to essentially filter URLs and also set up specific security policies as necessary. We also have the Files plugin that allows users to access all of their content right from within Workspace. And lastly, it's mobile aware. So depending on where you access these applications from, it's context aware and offers the best performance. So as a result of these different components, we can essentially deliver any application to the end user within their workspace and all of the content in a very simplistic fashion, and making the users the most productive. So what's changing for existing users that have on-premises XenApp and XenDesktop, for instance, and just upgrade Citrix Receiver to Workspace app? So from a user experience perspective, nothing really changes. The Receiver will upgrade to Workspace app at some point, but the UI will look pretty much the same. They will still be going into storefront. The icon will change, but it's minimal impact. It's just mainly the color that's being changed and the name. So if you're a customer leveraging XenApp and XenDesktop on premises, nothing really changes. But once you start consuming our cloud-based services in Workspace, that's when you see some of the new UI that I just went over. With that, we can go right into our demo. So first, I'm just going to log into Workspace. And as you can see, this is the web version of Workspace. I also have my Windows. I'm running this on a Windows endpoint, so you can see the Windows client here. And up top, you can see the universal search, so giving you the ability to search for any application and data or content that's being delivered as part of the Workspace. You also have access to all of the different applications that are delivered to you, and these can be organized in form of collections as well. You can then set up your favorites that can then be consumed on any device. These favorites roam with you no matter where you go. The same concept applies to desktops. You can essentially favorite the desktop that you most commonly use, and they'll be made available. But what's new is the integration with content, so essentially giving you access to all of your content, whether that's on premises or in the cloud, and across all of your different data sources, right from within your workspace. And not only that, you have the ability to essentially launch that file locally or launch within a virtual application. So for instance, if there's a certain type of file that you probably don't have locally installed, you can launch that application directly from within the workspace. But what I wanted to focus on within this demo is our capabilities around app access control, or specifically around SaaS applications. So let's take a look at Salesforce and Workday that's made available to me within my Workspace apps. I'm going to launch both here. And you'll notice that my Salesforce session and Workday session open up in the embedded browser that I talked to you about a little earlier. And once Salesforce launches up, the first thing you notice is that it's watermarked. So it shows that I'm launching it from so-and-so IP address. My navigation bar is completely disabled. I have also set advanced security policies whereby I cannot clipboard, I cannot print, and such from within this application. And because this content is flowing through our secure web gateway, if a malicious link was posted in here by someone, when I click on it, it'll be completely blocked. In addition to Salesforce, I also launched Workday, and you can see Workday launched as well. But for Workday, there's no watermarking in here. So all I did here is essentially single sign-on the user to Workday from within Workspace. So this talks about two unique use cases when thinking about SaaS apps. The first is protecting your intellectual property, and we help with that with our advanced security policies and embedded browser and secure web gateway. And the second is just providing users single sign-on to SaaS applications, and that's also possible by leveraging app access control. So another advantage of the solution is the fact that the user never really knows the credentials to these SaaS applications. So if they were to leave the organization, you can essentially disable access and they'll never be able to launch that application again. The third use case is essentially protecting against malicious data, so ransomware and such, and that can be made possible with Secure Browser. And Secure Browser is nothing but a hosted browser that Citrix manages for you, and it's completely isolated from your network. So it's a virtualized browser that we host for you that you can use to launch your SaaS applications and apply the same security policies that we talked about a little earlier. So here I've launched an article. This is basically a VMware Horizon 7.5 known issues website. I launched it within my secure browser. And as you can see, it launches within my local session, but using HTML5 receiver and ICA session, and thereby it's completely segmented from your network. So if a user were to click a malicious link from here, it has zero impact to your network because it's running on an isolated network. And it's completely stateless as well. So, what I just did is I showcased three different use cases for SaaS applications. One is to protect intellectual property. Second is to protect against ransomware and malware and such. And the third is just providing single sign-on. And all of that is possible with our solution. So now let's take a quick look at the configuration. So here's my Citrix Cloud admin console. I'm looking at adding a SaaS application. And as you can see, I've got a whole list of SaaS applications that I can pick from. Now, if your application is not in here, you can just skip this and add the app details by yourself. You go into app details, specify a name URL, related URLs and such. And then you go into enhanced security, and this is where you specify what sort of security controls you want to put in place. And lastly, you configure your SAML settings if you have them, or if you don't want single sign-on, you can just disable this altogether. Digging deeper into access security, you can specify whitelist and blacklist, so allowed sites, blocked sites. You can also specify which sites are redirected to secure browser sites. So these are this is where you specify which ones launch within your embedded browser, which ones launch within secure browser, which ones launch within your local browser. You can also filter specific website categories, and then you can also customize it if you need it. You can also specify which categories are allowed. So this is the advantage of our integration with Secure Web Gateway, the fact that you can do content filtering very easily for all of the SaaS applications that you've defined. So hopefully with this demo, you're able to understand our rich set of capabilities when it comes to app access control and SaaS applications, and also the unified experience with Workspace. Now let's move on, and the next thing I wanted to talk to you about is Workspace app availability. So right now there's a tech preview available, so if you want to get your feet wet with Workspace app and just try out the solution, it's available for you, and we've provided a link from where you'll get more details on how to download the tech preview. Also important to note that the tech preview has clients for Windows and Mac, but we will have clients for other platforms as well when the product GAs. So let's talk a little bit more about analytics next. On the left-hand side, we've got our Citrix ecosystem. So these are the different products that are available to you as part of Workspace. So this includes XenApp and XenDesktop. If you look at our customers today, many consume XenApp and XenDesktop. There are others who consume ShareFile, XenMobile, and such. But the bottom line is we can collect data points from all of these different services that allow us to understand user behavior based on those data points, right? And then, so this could include, where the users launch applications from, what devices they typically access, what's the behavior with regards to files, what IP addresses they come in from, and such. And then we broadly take all of that data and classify them into 4 buckets. We then use AI and machine learning to essentially create user risk profiles. And based on these user profiles, we can understand what the typical user behavior is and what the deviations from these from typical user behavior is. And based on these deviations, we can essentially alert the IT organizations for risk indicators. So we can provide different risk indicators based on these deviations, and we assign risk scores for each of these risk indicators. And we also categorize these risk indicators into high, medium, and low. This allows IT organizations then to essentially automate certain actions based on the specific risk indicator. And an important thing to keep in mind here is, compared to other SIM solutions out there, because ours is a closed loop system and we understand our products, we are able to give you a set of predefined risk indicators and actions that you can essentially utilize immediately. So there's nothing that you need to redefine. So if you compare that to other solutions where you have to ingest a lot of data or normalize the data, and then essentially understand, what the user behavior is, and then script certain actions and such, we simplify all of that for you and make it a much more turnkey solution that you can take advantage of. So taking a look at what's expected in our first release, which is slated for early August. From a risk indicator perspective, as you can see, across access files, mobile apps, and SaaS apps, there's a number of different risk indicators that are made available, and also for virtual apps and desktops. These will all be made available to you, and this presentation contains the details that will be shared with you later on. And from an actions perspective, this is the full list. Simple things like notifying admin or blocking a user, to essentially tightening DLP policies for your content, locking down your device or wiping your device as possible, initiating session recording. Even for SaaS applications, any SaaS application that's front-ended by Workspace, we can also provide analytics on those applications as well. Again, these are all features made available as part of version 1 of our product, and we will be updating the list of risk indicators and actions as we move along with future releases. And with that, I'll hand it over to Nick to talk about some of the key updates that didn't make the keynote.
Perfect. Thanks, George. I think you did an awesome job covering some of the highlights of the Synergy keynote there, including what's really happening behind the scenes with Workspace app and the access control functionality. I know I was really excited about the local embedded browser there and the integration with SWG, so I'm glad you covered that off in the demo. It also showed what's happening behind the scenes there on the config side, since I think that left some people wondering how to do that. But now I kind of want to switch gears and talk about some of the things that didn't quite make the keynote cut, or they didn't get maybe the stage time they deserved, in my opinion. So, I mean, let's face it, too. Not everybody's ready for the cloud, or might not be quite ready for that new Workspace experience. And the majority of our customers still have large swaths of XenApp and XenDesktop seats, deployed on-prem. So I want to spend a few minutes and talk about what's exciting or interesting for those, shall I say, classic Citrix customers. And the good news is there's a ton. There's a lot of new innovation and some major releases we actually shipped in the last 75 days or so since Synergy, as you can see from the slide here. And I'll give you a minute to sort of browse the list, but I'll go into each of these one by one in a minute here. And I'll spend the most time on some of my favorite additions to XenApp 7.18 and NetScaler 12.1 specifically, since those are both really major releases and really haven't gotten a ton of press to date. So let's start with one of those big ticket items that George mentioned in the XenApp CR, or current release, that just shipped last month. I think a lot of customers are going to be excited about this feature because I've certainly been getting pinged about it for the last 5+ years, I think. So thanks to the latest release of UPM that shipped alongside XenDesktop 7.18, we can now finally roam and persist that pesky Outlook search index. And it works in the popular non-persistent scenario, like with PBS pooled images. I don't know if a lot of people caught this, but a couple releases back, we introduced this feature called large file handling inside of UPM. And this new Outlook feature basically takes advantage of that to extract and roam a couple important files we need here, specifically the index database file and the OST. And what we do, via simple policy, by the way, is convert those two files to VHDX. So we put them in mini containers, and then we throw them in centralized locations so we can, roam them in and out. And this approach is very similar to what we've been doing with roaming profiles forever, by the way. Anyway, what happens is during the Outlook session, changes to the Outlook search index and OST are made directly to their respective VHDX files over SMB, and they simply follow the user around. So we can finally do this Outlook search roaming without any third-party products, and it makes me and George very happy. And best of all, you can take advantage of this today if this is something you've been waiting for. Next up, there's a couple new things in Director that really caught my eye. The first has to deal with logon times. This is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I authored an article a while back called The Rule of 30. And essentially, if your logon times are under 30 seconds, you're doing pretty well. If they're over 30, then maybe you should dig into it and see what's up. And one of the ways we dig into it is by using Director's report on logon times. That helpful report breaks down all the pieces of the logon process, so group policy processing, authentication, printer, drive mappings, etc. But there was always one piece of this process that wasn't well defined, and it kind of bothered me, to be honest. And it could be a huge chunk in some cases. I think that was why it was so bothersome. It's called interactive session. I'm sure that's familiar to a number of you out there. And like I said earlier, sometimes this little piece could be 20 seconds alone. And it was a kind of a mystery what was happening behind the scenes there. Well, I'm proud to announce that we finally break that portion down into 3 measurable pieces. So now you can tell if it's really something with the shell or the delay might lie with like the user init piece. So very helpful for troubleshooting those long logon times, and something I'm sure a lot of customers will want to take advantage of. The second new feature that shipped with Director 7.18 is something called application probing. I bet many of our old school Citrix customers out there remember EdgeSite AAM, if that rings a bell, or it was active application monitoring. Well, this new Director feature is pretty similar to that. I put a little screenshot there so you can see how it's configured, but you basically specify an app like Epic or SAP to launch periodically on any machines in your farm or environment you want. And then you tell it how often to run that probe and who to email if there's a launch failure. So pretty handy for proactively diagnosing those not so fun denial of service events in the Citrix world. And then the last thing I'll point out is there is some new media associated with this. So there's a lightweight app probe agent that's like 2 to 3 megs in size you'll want to grab. All right, next up, I want to talk about some of the underlying graphics enhancements we made in 7.18. It seems like our engineers are always making the ICA or HDX protocol better and better every release. And if you Google HDX graphics goodies, you'll see an article by one of the engineers, Mohammed Dawood, who incorporated these features. And the first is something we were calling fuzzy first internally, but you also might hear progressive display. I believe that's what's in the blog there. And don't let the name fool you, since we actually had PD like 10 years ago. This is a totally different implementation. And the basic idea is to be smart about the network conditions. If the conditions aren't great, like low bandwidth or high latency, then we'll automatically sense that and reduce the image and text quality while the user is active. And then as the user becomes less active, we'll build the lossless and make it look amazing again. So the picture might be fuzzy at first, but then very sharp and crisp, when you actually need it. The second graphics enhancement is a bit easier to explain, I think. We've always had this build the lossless policies in the product, but historically when we did that build, we've used variable quality JPEG for compression, which has actually served us quite well in most cases, but it really does suffer in high latency scenarios. So starting with 7.18, we changed the build to lossless from JPEG to H.264. You'll need a Windows or Linux receiver for now, but the difference is pretty amazing over WAN scenarios. There's a cool YouTube video showing the difference side by side that you might want to check out if you're interested. But the best part about both of these graphics enhancements, no new policies and no receiver upgrades required. The other question, of course, I asked Mohammed right away, since it's near and dear to my heart, is what about the impact of SSS or single server scalability? Do these things require extra CPU? And we already did some testing, and the answer is nothing. So There's no overhead associated with this. Your triple S, or scalability or user density, whatever you want to call it, should be the same. So some really great stuff there for sure. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on this slide is the Linux VDA. It got some huge enhancements in this release and now supports critical items such as DTLS for encryption, MCS for provisioning, and then FAS for auth. So if you're a shop with Linux VDA, this is kind of a must-have release. Next up is a slide I threw in here at the last minute because it recently bit our consulting team in the field, and I want to make sure we share this lesson learned with the world. Behind the scenes in the latest receiver release, we made some pretty significant changes to the crypto kit we use. We added DTLS 1.2 support, and we essentially removed support for all the legacy TLS cipher suites that don't offer forward secrecy. And as you can see in the screenshot there, it's all the stuff with RSA in the name. And why is this important? Well, quite a few older versions of our products use these ciphers, or maybe hard-coded to use these in some cases. So when you upgrade, it could break even basic things like session launch and cause another denial of service to your Citrix environment. The one last thing I see people already overlooking, don't forget about the NetScaler side as well. So if you need this legacy cipher suite support, you'll have to edit the SSL ciphers option. It's under advanced SSL settings in the console. And then you simply add SHA-2 and RSA to the configured list as shown there. So hopefully this saves you a headache in the event that app launches suddenly start failing after upgrading to receiver 4.12. This is probably the first place to look. All right, so next up, Citrix Hypervisor. So with version 7.5, we got a couple things I'm pretty excited about. The first is we now support up to 64 hosts in a resource pool. So instead of scaling out with several smaller pools for those large XenDesktop, or VDI deployments, we can now create much bigger pools and really simplify administration. So that's just kind of nice to have there. The second item is something I've been waiting about 7 or 8 years for, if I'm being honest. I wrote an article, way back when, sort of demystifying why XenServer was creating thick storage on block-based storage, like Fiber Channel and iSCSI, even when thin provisioning was supported by the back-end storage array. Well, it's because we didn't support we didn't have a shared or clustered file system like GFS2. So now that we experimentally support GFS2, we can create these true thin provisioned, SRs or storage repositories and save a ton of money on storage. So, by the way, GFS2, it stands for Global File System 2. And while it's changed a few hands over the years, Red Hat currently has the reins. And the idea behind these clustered file systems is pretty simple. And VMFS, by the way, is another example of a clustered or shared file system. But what these do is they allow multiple hosts to concurrently access and even write to a piece of raw storage in a safe manner. So that's really what they're doing, is kind of buffering or controlling the reads and the writes there. And that allows us to thin provision, so that's very nice. All right, next up, app layering. So the former Unidesk rock stars have been pretty busy since Synergy with actually 2 new releases. So we shipped 4.11 right after Synergy. Let me build this out for a second here. So we shipped 4.11 right after Synergy, and then 4.12 actually just last week. And both have a few noteworthy features. While the full user layer remains in labs, I know, we're all waiting for it. But we do now provide support for the latest Win 10 releases, like 18.03 and 4.12 actually, not 17.03 as it says there. And we beefed up our Azure support. So now the Azure connector supports both servers and desktops, including the latest Win 10 releases, as I mentioned, with MCS. So that sort of completes that connector functionality, and I know a lot of customers are waiting for that dual support, if you want to call it. Another feature worth highlighting from 4.11 is the specialized Office 365 user layer. So we now support each user persisting those settings in session host scenarios. And lastly, there's one additional labs feature. I think that's on the screen there now. But George and I are really excited about. We were just actually talking about it yesterday. And that's the ability for Elastic layers to be used across totally different OS layers. So up until now, Elastic layer assignments required that the app layer assigned use the same OS layer that we use to create the app layer. So now you can assign an app layer as an Elastic layer on a layered image that uses a different OS layer. So give that a whirl and let us know if you have any feedback before we GA it. build this slide out here. All right, so I saved one of the best for last, NetScaler. We quietly shipped a major release in late May, and there are several things worth mentioning. I'm not going to go into every one of them here, but similar to what we did with Receiver 4.12, remember we pulled all the weak ciphers, we did the same in NetScaler 12.1. All those cryptographically weak ciphers that don't support that forward secrecy that we need, they've totally been removed from the default cipher group. And along with that, we built a new secure SSL profile, I think we're calling it, that we're using as the default. And this one will provide that magic A+ rating that you're looking for from SSL Labs. So that's all awesome. And to facilitate some of the workspace magic that George was talking about and showing off earlier, we've totally reworked the SaaS app catalog. And he mentioned that you have the ability to add your own here too. One last thing I'll highlight before we move on is we're now 64-bit across the board on NetScaler. In the past, the actual MPX and VPX instances and systems, they were all running 32-bit. With the 12.1 release, we're running 64-bit natively, so that was quite a major change and undertaking for us kind of behind the scenes there. All right, I probably talked enough, and I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So at this point, I'll turn it back over to George to talk through some cloud highlights and wrap it up. And I'll talk to everyone in about 5 minutes when we get to the live Q&A. Thanks for listening, and take it away, George.
Thanks, Nick. I think we covered a number of these. Let's build this slide out. All right, so workspace side aggregation, I think Nick touched on this. So if you are an existing XenApp and XenDesktop customer but want to leverage Workspace and maybe some additional services that are offered in like content collaboration or Xen Mobile Unified Endpoint Management and whatnot, you would have to take advantage of Workspace side aggregation, which allows you to tie your existing on-premises XenApp and XenDesktop instances to Workspace itself, thereby allowing you to aggregate those virtual apps and desktops from within Workspace. I think we talked enough about Azure Gov. I'm going to skip past that. PVS integration and administration is another big one. So in the past, when you talk to customers wanting to leverage Citrix Cloud Services, one of the key asks was the ability to manage or essentially administer PVS workloads right from within Studio in Citrix Cloud. And now we have the ability to do that. So essentially, you can manage your PVS workloads on premises directly from within Studio in the cloud. WEM service, again, for customers, for any of you that are not familiar with WEM, Workspace Environment Management, this is a persona management solution that we have that allows for both resource optimization and also login optimizations and, doing a lot of the, persona management things like shortcut management and such, app clamping, the list goes on. But what we announced is that we're going to make WEM a service that's offered as part of Citrix Cloud. And the advantage here is that the customer no longer has to deploy the infrastructure required to run the service. And all they need to do is essentially deploy agents on their VDAs itself and then manage it directly from within Citrix Cloud. This is expected in this quarter, so towards the end of the quarter. And then a couple of features that we've been constantly requested about. One is delegated administration. The second is configuration logging. Both are expected to be released soon. Another feature that I wanted to mention that's not listed here is Citrix branding. So within Workspace, you have branding to a certain degree as far as custom logos and text and things like that. But we are going to be offering a branding service that will allow customers to take branding to a whole new level, including the ability to essentially brand the Workspace icon itself, and a lot of good stuff there. And it doesn't just apply to the Workspace client; it also applies to mobile clients and such. So stay tuned for that. We'll have more information made available later in the quarter. So what's next and how can we help? So we've included some resources that will help you, dig deeper into some of the stuff we talked about. First off, the Workspace App Tech Preview. Make sure to check it out and provide us feedback on your experiences with the Workspace app. As I mentioned earlier, it's available for Windows and Mac today. Secondly, for more information on Citrix Analytics, do visit this link. I believe there's a Tech Preview White Glove program available for that as well. And if you want to learn more about some of the announcements from Synergy, Jason's written a great blog on some of the announcements, and I have a blog out there as well that touches on some of the announcements that didn't make the keynote, so be sure to check those out. And then, it's important to note that there's a number of great training resources that are available as part of Citrix Education that you should take a look at to further your knowledge in some of our offerings. So we've included a few here, but there are plenty more available on our website. And then keep in mind that the next tips webinar is going to be a really good one. It's about the Citrix Office 365 story, and that's going to be hosted by Ryan McClure, who's one of our star enterprise architects, and Pierre Marmignon, who is a principal architect within our engineering team and also the founder of NetScaler, which was later rebranded as Workspace Environment Management. So that's going to be a really good one and one you should not miss. And with that, I want to thank you all for attending this webinar, and I want to pass it back to Virginia.
Thank you. Great session, guys. All right, before we go into Q&A, I would like to remind our audience that if you have a question for our speakers, you can submit it in the Ask a Question area on your screen. Simply type your question into the text box and then hit Submit. We likely won't have time to answer all the questions here today live, but keep an eye on the Citrix blog for a complete rundown of the FAQs. Okay, Nick, I'm going to hand it over to you to start our Q&A.
Thanks, Virginia. So George and I are both still on, and we'll now start, the questions. And it looks like we actually have a good dozen or so questions that already came in, which is nice. But before we begin, I wanted to introduce one more person we have on our Q&A panel today, and that's Carissa Stringer. Carissa is the Director of Product Marketing in our Workspace Services group. And similar to George and myself, Carissa is a longtime Citrite with tons of experience, and she was actually one of the few folks on stage at Synergy doing the live demos during the keynote. So welcome, Carissa. It's great to have you.
Thanks so much, Nick and George, for letting me join today.
No worries. Glad to have you. And now let's dive into some questions. So I'll sort of divvy them up as we go here. And if for some reason we don't get to your question or accidentally skip it, as Virginia said, maybe we'll follow up with, either directly with you or we'll put together a FAQ and publish it on Citrix blogs. All right, so first question. Regarding Workspace app, what's the difference in behavior for SaaS apps between the web and native clients? Okay, George, you want to take that one?
Sure, Nick. So as I showed in the demo, right, so when it comes to SaaS applications, they can be launched either from the native client, or we also have the web client for Workspace app. And there is a little bit of a difference in behavior depending on how you configure the SaaS app. So if you configure enhanced security and you configure it to launch within the embedded browser, when the user launches that application within the Workspace app web client, it's going to launch that application within secure browser. As far as policies and such, nothing changes, because whether you're using the SaaS application within secure browser or the embedded browser, secure web gateway is still in line in both those cases. So as far as URL filtering and such, all of those policies still apply. And you can also, put in place other security policies like copy pasting restrictions and clipboarding and such, which will be applied. So hopefully that's clear. So, the key thing to keep in mind is that if you are launching a SaaS application from the web-based client, you don't have the embedded browser available to you. So certain SaaS apps will be launched within the secure browser.
Got it. Thanks, George. Next question. What's the policy to enable the Outlook search redirection feature? I think you mentioned something about large files. And what files should I see after this is enabled? So let me take that one. And that's actually a good question because I think it's a little confusing, and I probably confused you. I mentioned we built this feature on top of the UPM feature called large file handling. And there's a UPM policy called large file handling, files to be created as symbolic links, I think. And while that's really what's being used behind the scenes to enable this new feature, we made the process more intuitive. So there's a new policy in 7.18, so you'll have to grab the latest ADMX. And it's specifically called Enable Search Index Roaming for Outlook. And it's kind of hidden under Advanced Settings within the UPM there. So that's what you'll want to enable, and then it will sort of trigger that large file handling stuff behind the scenes and work its magic. And again, all this is really doing is creating two VHDX files that can be roamed and persisted. If you look at the system after enabling it, you'll see an Outlook OST.vhdx file, and then you'll see an Outlook Search Index.vhdx file. And they'll be mounted as, it's called like Citrix_UPM_disk volumes under disk management, if you also want to validate there. Always kind of a nice touch. So that's that. Next question. Can you tell us more details about that branding service that George mentioned, specifically how it's different from what's available today? Krista, do you want to grab that one?
Sure, I'll chime in there. So the branding service is obviously something we're very excited about. So just to give you a little bit of maybe comparison there for what we have today. So a lot of the changes that you would have to make to the UI interface will mostly be something that you have to go in and customize yourself. The nice part here is the new rebranding service will actually be a web service. So you'll be able to work within it as a Citrix Cloud. Sorry, it's a cloud service. You'll be able to work within the cloud service, and it's basically designed to work very closely with the Workspace app UI, so you can actually customize the look and feel of that UI. So that is a coming soon feature, but I did want to kind of call it out there. So thanks, Nick.
Perfect. Thanks, Krista. Next question. I've heard about these risk indicators in analytics. Can you tell me a bit more about how they work and some real examples of risk indicators? George, you want to grab that one?
Sure. So just to recap on the user behavior analytics feature, right? So the way it works is as users consume different services offered within Citrix Workspace, that allows us to understand various data points of the user behavior. So we broadly put these data points into 4 buckets, and then we use these buckets, we normalize the data using AI and machine learning, and then create user profiles, security profiles based on those the data that we are collecting. Now, what risk indicators typically are deviations from the user typical behavior. So for instance, if the user logs in from Chicago 9 out of 10 times, and all of a sudden I'm seeing him logging in from Korea, that would be flagged as a risk indicator. And then, the key point here is that every risk indicator is actionable. So you can set a policy where if you see such an action, you want to essentially force two-factor authentication or log the user off, or any action that is supported by any one of the services that are offered within Workspace. So some of the examples of risk indicators, I just mentioned logging in from an IP address that is not recognized, so that's one. If excessive file downloads is another. Jailbroken devices would be one, or if, let's say, some other, passcodes missing and such. Those are all factors that we can consider as risk indicators. And then another thing to keep in mind is we cumulatively show you what the highest of, the biggest offenders are within your organization. So we collect all the risk indicators. We tabulate the total score, and in your dashboard you'll see the top 5, top 10 offenders, and from there you can dig deeper into all the different risk indicators that are associated with that user along those 4 broad categories that I mentioned, like access data and such. And then for each risk indicator, you can then assign an action. So for instance, if the user is downloading a lot of files all of a sudden, you can essentially start recording or maybe disable the user share file account, things like that.
Perfect. Thanks, George. There's probably like 4 questions here about directors, so I'm going to try to just hammer through those really quick. So first one, my company is experiencing long logon times, well, about 50 seconds, so certainly over your 30-second threshold you mentioned. And interactive session is the biggest piece. So I'm excited to hear about that new thing where you can break down that part. Can you go into more detail on those 3 subparts? Yeah, let me take that one. So the first is pre-user init, and that's the segment which kind of overlaps with GPOs and scripts. And then the second part is user init. And by the way, we reference user init a lot because when a user logs onto a Windows machine, WinLogon runs a critical process called userinit.exe. Anyways, this second part, it reestablishes network connections and then starts explorer.exe, which is the Windows user interface. And then the third and final part is the shell, and that's the time between like the initialization of the UI to the time that you actually receive, the user actually receives keyboard and mouse control. So when you add up those 3 kind of subphases, you roughly get the total duration of interactive session. And I say roughly because there's actually a little bit of overlap in some phases. Like we break out things like group policy and logon scripts into separate buckets from interactive session. But you just heard me say that pre-user init, includes some GPO and script processing time. And that's actually correct, since there's a little bit of additional processing that occurs at that stage. But the main point is the sum of the 3 subphases is going to be pretty darn close. And breaking down interactive session into 3 additional parts gives us a lot more insight into what's really taking the longest. So hopefully that explains it in more detail, and you can get your login times down under 30 seconds. The next one about director is this director feature enabled for all license variations? So they didn't specify which one, but there's a couple things I talked about. So the interactive session and breaking that down, yes, that's available across the board in all entitlements. The app probing functionality, that is not. That is a platinum-only feature. Can I use? There's two questions actually on this one. Can I use Director 718 with a 7.15 site to take advantage of interactive session breakdown? So you actually cannot. So there is so how we actually put that information into that directory report is from the client-side VDA. So there's an additional virtual channel we added several years back. It's called like EUV or something, and it actually is piping the information upstream. So you do need that 7.18 VDA to take advantage. Kind of going back to the top here, I think that's all it for director. Is there a way to create and manage bookmarks within the secure browser? So I'm assuming you're talking about the XenApp Secure Browser service, and yes, there actually is. We don't call them bookmarks, but we call them, I think it's like website shortcuts. So within the Studio and kind of console there, you can go into the Manage Receiver for Websites screen, and then there's a place called Website Shortcuts, and you can kind of add in some custom shortcuts there, which essentially accomplishes the same thing. Next question, is there an option to add two-factor auth for the Auth to Workspace app? I don't know, George or Krista, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Sure, Nick. So as far as two-factor auth goes, it depends how what your deployment is like. So if you're keeping your NetScalers on-prem and just using, let's say, XenApp and XenDesktop service, yeah, you can use two-factor auth in that scenario. Just the way you would do today with NetScaler and Radius configuration. If you are leveraging the NetScaler gateway service for front-ending Workspace, so two-factor auth is not yet available in that scenario, but it is expected in the near future. If you are deploying a net new Citrix deployment in, let's say, one of the public clouds, Azure, AWS, and such, and you're deploying your NetScaler VPX instances within your resource location, and then tying it back to Citrix Cloud Services, again, you can enforce two-factor authentication in that scenario just by configuring your NetScalers.
Perfect. Thanks, George. I think there is one more related to director here. I'll take. So, do the interactive session portion go into further detail on device mapping to the sessions? For example, multiple USB devices. So, not today, at least. We don't break it out. Like you can't see, USB 1, USB 2, USB 3. I mean, we obviously have the client, drive or device mapping kind of portion or phase broken out, but it doesn't go into detail. But it's something that might be. It's something I think we're looking at. Next question: Linux VDA with MCS. Is it still limited to certain hypervisors? We were kind of trying to figure this one out, I think, as we saw it come in. George or Krista, did you guys figure anything out there? I don't think so, but not
Yes,
positive.
I actually did. So today it's actually limited to XenServer, but obviously we're looking to add additional hypervisors in the future. So thanks for submitting that question early. I was able to chase it down. Perfect.
Thanks, Krista. Next one, any plans to port some of the new features of 7.18 back to the 7.15 LTSR as like a CU? Specifically things like the login time monitoring or app probing. Krista, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I'm happy to take. Yeah, sure. So unfortunately, the answer is no, right? The benefit of LTSR is really keeping consistency across all the components. However, I will say when we announce an LTSR, right, our target for shipping LTSRs is every 2 to 3 years. And obviously, if we are this quarter exactly 1 year from when we ship 7.15. So I would say just keep your eyes peeled. There should be announcements coming very shortly here on when our next target LTSR is. And then obviously you can make that transition and embrace the new features.
Perfect. Next one comes from the UK. Can you talk through any roadmap plans to improving the studio experience with Citrix Cloud? Chris, I don't know what you want to, probably not in this forum, but obviously we're happy to talk through some of those things if you want to schedule kind of an offline session.
Yeah, and maybe just as a reference, like I'll just use an example for you. So obviously it's a bigger conversation, and of course, Nick and George, that'd be a great angle for you. But I do think you can see some progress on things there. So the Azure Quick Deploy is probably one of my favorite examples. You're seeing something that we're trying to take, which is, a web-based, very quick way to deploy your workloads on Azure. So that's one thing we're introducing. So we're making progress there. But yeah, I don't have any exact timelines I can share on a call.
So Nick, I just want to add that there have been some performance improvements already in place with Studio, and I think they're actively working on improving it further. So there will be some architectural changes that should improve performance significantly.
Yep.
And maybe Nick, can I add one more point on that one, if that's okay?
Absolutely.
One thing I always like to highlight when people mention that is, it is the fact that the code stack is identical between on-prem and the cloud. And I always just want to make that point to everybody that it's very beneficial as a customer to make sure you know that, because that means we're able to move very faster, right? All the engineering teams are aligned because we're working on one code stack, whether you're deploying everything on-prem or in the cloud. So you'll see that kind of everything move in lockstep together. So I know today you might have questions about it, but there really is good intention behind it.
Perfect. Just got a couple more minutes, and there's actually still questions flowing in, so we'll just try to grab a few of them here. One, does Citrix Cloud support limit visibility like XenApp on-prem? Marco is asking that. Do you know, George or Carissa, the limit visibility?
I am not certain.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not certain off the top of my head.
Okay, Marco H, we'll follow up with you offline on that one directly. It's a good one. Can you show the links page, please? Oh, like the references? I think we can go back maybe, like the resources page. Yeah, the other thing too, I'll say, I don't know if we can build that slide out. But Paul, if you want to check out these references, there we go. But this will be available. The recording is going to be available from the same link. So if you want to just go and access this right afterwards, you can. And also, I think we always throw these on YouTube, so it'll be uploaded to YouTube probably tomorrow, or the next day. Can you launch a locally installed program like Office through Workspace app if the user's offline? George, do you want to take that one?
So today it's not available. I know it's been discussed as something that we're looking into from a roadmap perspective. So, when we GA the product, it won't be made available, but something we're looking into in the future.
Question Marco was asking about the Outlook's kind of search indexing feature there. Is it SMB share? So yeah, we are using SMB basically to directly access those VHDX files that are stored in like the user profile, for example. Maybe one for Carissa here. On the Tech Preview website, there's an option to download HTML5 Workspace app and Workspace app hosting. What's the difference between the two?
So I did see that come in, and I tried to chase it. My success rate is not as high on that question as it was for the Linux one. So I will have to get back to you on that. So.
All right, cool. So Dave, yeah, we'll follow up with you on that one. Will PVS management be included in Citrix Studio on-premise? Volker was asking. George, or
Yeah, so I think right now with the latest release, we can actually manage on-prem PVS workloads directly from within Citrix Studio in Citrix Cloud Service. So you can actually deploy catalogs and such directly from within the hosted Studio and Cloud Services. That's a net new feature that was added recently.
Yeah, I think we did. I'm going back to the Citrix Cloud Highlights slide there. So that's that PVS integration / administration. That's kind of what George was highlighting there. Yeah, so I think we got through about 20 questions. There are a couple we missed, or one or two kind of future roadmap questions I probably can't answer. So yeah. Oh wait, there's one maybe. Well, when will there be an API for app layering so that we can script some tasks? That's Volker's asking kind of another futures question. I don't know, Carissa, if you can answer that or want to answer that.
Yeah, unfortunately I don't. Yeah, I can't give timelines. That's where my hands are tied.
All right.
So Nick, I just want to add that one of our CTAs, Ryan Butler, created I believe, an SDK that's a bunch of PowerShell scripts and such that you can leverage to automate a lot of the app layering tasks. So that's something that you can look at. You can just Google Ryan Butler app layering SDK.
Perfect. Yep, I remember seeing that. Thanks, George. So we're at the top of the hour, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Thanks, George. Thanks, Carissa. And again, if we happen to miss your question, we'll follow up either directly. A couple of these I think that I called out, we'll follow up directly since they're kind of specific. Otherwise, thanks for tuning in, and we really appreciate your time today. Talk to everyone later. Bye.